Today on the LowDOWN, the Down Syndrome podcast, Mark Wafer give us the lowdown on employing people with Down syndrome and why it makes good sense for business. Over to you, Hannah and Marla.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm really excited for this episode of the LowDOWN podcast. Meaningful employment is a hot topic within the Down syndrome community, and it's an important goal and milestone for many individuals with Down syndrome. As our students transition into young adulthood, the focus in therapy often shifts from academic skills to employment skills, such as time management, navigation, maintaining a high level of personal hygiene, and social conversations with peers. These skills become an increased priority when our clients and students identify employment as a meaningful goal. However, there are many barriers to employment, and one of the biggest is a misconception around the costs and benefits of employing people with different abilities. Many employers may be hesitant, and that is why we brought in today's guest.
Mark Wafer is a Canadian business entrepreneur who happens to be hearing impaired. He owned multiple Tim Hortons restaurants in the Greater Toronto area, which we all call the GTA, and employed more than 200 workers with disabilities, including many people with Down syndrome. Now, Mark is a full-time disability advocate, and he was recently featured in the 321 magazine in the winter 2020 issue. Hi, Mark, and thanks for joining us here on the Lowdown.
My honor to be here.
Oh, we're so excited to have you. Before we chat in depth about employment, we have some secret questions for you that are not related that will help our listeners get to know you a little bit better. Does that sound okay for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so question number one. Since you are a Tim Hortons franchise owner, we have to ask you, what is your favorite Tim Hortons donut?
Favorite Tim Hortons donut?
Yep.
Well, it's been many years since I've eaten a donut, but the Boston cream is by far the best.
Oh, that is a delicious one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm impressed it's been many years since you've had a donut because I do not have that willpower at all. What would you say is the best tourist attraction for visitors who want to see Toronto?
The best tourist attraction in Toronto is, without question, the CN Tower.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go up to CN Tower, you can see every other tourist attraction in one day.
All in one. I know Hina's done that, haven't you, Hina?
Yeah, so the DSRF had a conference in Toronto 2 years ago, and we had a little bit of time before heading back to the West Coast. So my colleague Susan and I actually went on you have an express train that goes from kind of the airport area into downtown Toronto, and we got a chance to see the CN Tower. We actually even treated ourselves and went up and had lunch there. It was such an amazing view from up there.
Well, actually, when you take that train, you get so close to the CN Tower, you feel like you can touch it.
Yes. Very cool. Okay, Mark, this is a question coming from a West Coaster. What is your favorite hockey team?
You want me to think about that for a second?
I have an idea what your answer will be, but I thought maybe you might pick another one.
Well, it may come as a big surprise, but it's the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah. All right. We'll just leave it at that, I guess.
Mind you, it's important to know, and we were very embarrassed by this 2 months ago when we lost to a Zamboni driver.
Yes, that was definitely an interesting day for Toronto Maple Leaf fans. Yeah, that was kind of cool though. Also, I mean, yes, it was your team, but it was kind of cool to see that Zamboni driver kind of live out his NHL dream. So,
he had his moment.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, we have 2 more secret questions left. So the fourth question is, what is your favorite vacation destination?
That's a tough question because I've been very fortunate, and I've traveled to about probably 1/3 of the countries in the world over the last 25 years. So very, very fortunate indeed. There's some places that I fell in love with, Italy being one of them, but also really enjoy traveling to India. I was just in India about 6 weeks ago, just before all of this shut down with the pandemic. But I'm not one for sitting on a beach or going to hot spots. It's been many years since I've done something like that, but my wife and I, we travel the world with Rotary International. So we get to see, rather than tourist attractions, we get to see how people really live in other countries, and I much prefer that.
That's amazing. Yeah, India must have been a bit of a culture shock for you, or how was that experience?
I've had a few culture shocks in my time.
Yeah.
Traveling to China, India the first time. Obviously, the first time to go to India was quite a shock.
Yeah.
But also in August we were in Pristina in Kosovo, which is in Europe, but is a poor country. It's an emerging nation.
Yeah. Amazing. Okay, and our last question for you is, what is a book that you would recommend entrepreneurs read, or a book that you've read that you've really found helpful for entrepreneurship?
That's an interesting question. So I believe that true entrepreneurship cannot be based simply on making money or just having new ideas for new businesses. It has to entail a certain level of empathy for society. And so it's important to leave your mark as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, on how you shape society, how you change society, how you help society. So there is a book that was written 2 years ago by Dr. Brian Goldman called The Power of Kindness. And it's a book that features about 25 different people, many of them from business, who have used their empathy skills in order to not only do better and do good for society, but also to increase their success in business. And I truly believe that business people and entrepreneurs are simply stuck on the bottom line. They will fail. Being in business, being successful, especially in the long term, requires so much more. Your employees, you have to look after them. You have to respect them. Respect really being the key word. Businesses that are today not showing respect for their employees during this pandemic will be judged. Yeah. And so that's a book that I would recommend any business owner take the time to read.
Great.
Power of Kindness.
Power of Kindness. Awesome. Yeah, we'll try to find a link to that and put it on our episode page too, so people can find it a bit easier. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that outlook. And I think it is so important to kind of let business owners and entrepreneurs know to approach their business from that perspective. Okay, well, thanks for answering our secret questions, Mark. I feel like that was kind of a fun way to start this. Let's start out by getting to know you. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background.
Well, I was born in the UK, moved to Canada in 1974 as a 12-year-old. I was born deaf. I have about roughly 15 to 20% hearing. I wear Bluetooth hearing aids. I'm listening to you now through Bluetooth on my iPhone. I went many years without hearing aids because technology actually didn't exist. And so I'm a proficient lip reader. I went to regular schools when I came to Canada. I went to college and had a huge interest in motorsports. My cousins, when I was young, my cousins who were much older than me would take me to motorcycle and car races when we were in the UK. And I got involved in that here in Canada. And I actually just hung up my helmet last year. Oh, so I raced for 33 years. I've won 17 races. I've won 2 championships, and it's been a wonderful experience. But I did it at an amateur level. I mean, the speeds are the same speed that the professionals do, but it was an amateur series, and really enjoyed it. But it was time to give it up. And in fact, I just sold my race car yesterday.
Wow!
So that's just I sold my race car right in the middle of a pandemic. Can you imagine that? So it's on its way to Germany now to a new team. But because I was involved in motorsports, I spent most of my formative years working in the auto industry, mostly in the service and parts department of car dealerships, until the early 90s when my wife and I decided we were going to open a business of some kind. At that time, we didn't know what it was. And sure enough, actually, we thought we would end up with a car dealership, but an opportunity came along to buy a Tim Hortons. And of course, that's the Canadian dream. And so we didn't hesitate. And we opened our first restaurant in the early 90s in Scarborough, Ontario. And over the 25 years we were there, we created a group of stores that totaled 14 by the time we had sold our last store in 2017. So we've been out of the chain now for 2 years. I spend most of my time now working as an activist in the disability community and in the business community, ensuring that people with disabilities are not overlooked when it comes to employment. We've got terrible, dismal unemployment numbers, always have had. And so it's important to make employers aware of this great talent pool that can work, qualified to work, and certainly willing to get out there.
Yeah. Wow, what an amazing life story. I like the car racing thing is so cool. Yeah, kind of an end of an era.
Don't get me started on that.
Okay. Hey, you never know. Yeah, no, that's pretty incredible. And you had mentioned that, and Marla had mentioned this earlier in your intro, that you do have a hearing impairment. And I want to know, like, what challenges did you face when you entered the workforce and began to kind of make a career for yourself? How did that impact your career?
Very much so. When I was a teenager, I would get the typical jobs like paper route, selling ice cream out of a bike, bringing shopping carts in from parking lot at the grocery store, and I had very little trouble finding a job because I could hide my hearing. But once I got the job, I usually lost it because I couldn't answer the phone. The announcement would be made for the buggy boy to go out into the parking lot. Of course, I wouldn't hear the announcement. As soon as they found out I was deaf, they would fire me. And it actually got to the point where I got a job at a oil change place, and I got fired by lunchtime on the first day.
Oh, wow.
And I said to the manager, "So you're firing me because I'm deaf?" He says, "No, I'm firing you because you were stupid." And I was so excited because he wasn't firing me because I was deaf anymore. I got fired for some sort of reason, and I thought that was really exciting. So I ran home and told my mother that I had gotten fired again, but this time it wasn't because I was deaf, it was because I was stupid. Yeah. And I thought, hey, we're getting places.
Yeah, progress, I guess. Yeah.
But it was sad. It was very difficult. I didn't have a lot of confidence back in those days, which is normal for someone who has a significant disability. Where I started to make it was when I started working in the auto industry. I was working for a gentleman who owned a number of car dealerships, and he recognized I had to work harder than everybody else. That's something that you'll find with people with disabilities. You've got to try harder. You've got to work harder, because those who you're working with, those who you're working for, are waiting for you to fail. And so I would always put in 20% more effort. And the owner of the franchise, the owner of the car dealerships recognized that. And so I ran up the rank pretty fast. And by the time I left, I was what we call the back-end supervisor. So that meant I was in charge of the service center, the body shop, and the parts department. And my hearing hasn't changed. But the attitude of the managers and the attitude of the owner had changed. They recognized that I was a valuable employee. I was quite often a top salesperson. 1 year, I helped the dealership to win the President's Award for Chrysler Canada. Wow. And those were achievements that they knew I had done, regardless of whether I was deaf or not. And so they started valuing me as a good employee. Yeah.
Yeah. Focusing on looking beyond the fact that you were deaf, but looking at what value you bring to the business, right? And that's kind of such an important component.
One of the benefits of being treated that way is that my confidence level rose dramatically.
Such a good point.
We see that a lot when people with disability get their first job. Very unsure of themselves at the beginning, always waiting to be told you can't do that, or you're not doing that right, or and they expect that. They're always hearing the word no, or you can't. And so you don't feel confident with those words. So when you're told you're doing a good job, that's great. You know, we really appreciate you coming to work today. We really appreciate you made a contribution to our business. It's such a great way to build confidence in a person.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a good point. So Mark, as you became a business owner, you made it a priority to provide employment for many individuals with disabilities, including Down syndrome. So how many employees with disabilities have you hired through the years?
Well, those that we know of, that we purposely hired who have a disability is at well over 200. Any given time, around 15 to 18% of our workforce were people with disabilities.
Amazing.
However, we do know that people, without telling us, had applied to work in our group of stores, knowing that we had a track record of hiring people with disabilities. And since 70% of disabilities are non-visible, we know that we hired many who never did tell us. Some of them were quite obvious. We did hire some people who had Asperger's or had autism. That didn't tell us. They didn't self-identify. But since we knew how a person may act or work or socialize with autism, we knew that person had a disability. And we respected that. We respected the fact that they didn't want to tell us. We treated everybody the same. That it wasn't them and us. It was everybody as one.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So, for other entrepreneurs listening to this, when they hear that 16 to 18% of your workforce had a self-identified disability at any given time, I can just see people's minds spinning really fast, thinking like that must be terrible for the bottom line, but that's not actually what you found. And you discovered that hiring people with disabilities had really a positive effect on the success of your business. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it's interesting how we came to that conclusion. Quite frankly, when I hired the first person with a disability, I did not understand at that time that by building capacity, that we would have a healthier bottom line, or we would have lower turnover, or we would have a more innovative workforce. I didn't understand. I didn't know that. I don't think anybody knew that back at that time. So the first person who we hired with a disability, Clint Sparling, has Down syndrome. He was 23 years old at the time, eager to work, and he applied for a job where we had just simply put a notice in the window looking for somebody to look after our dining room. And the reason I hired him is because, first of all, I hadn't had a lot of experience being around people with intellectual disabilities. So I didn't really know what to expect. But I did know that if he kept knocking on doors, cold calling, he wouldn't get a job. Nobody was going to hire him. But this was 25 years ago. So I gave him a shot. And we elected to help a community living in Toronto, job coaches who work free of charge to a business. And that's right across Canada. Agencies that have job coaches will help an employer free of charge. And so they came in and they helped teach Clint, not so much the job itself, we did that, but things like learning which bus to take, learning how to put the uniform on and making sure you look good when you come to work. Understanding that if you start at 9, you need to be at the workplace 10 minutes before that, time management. Understanding all of these things, and this is what they helped us to do. You can imagine that in my first week as a business owner, I'm already very, very busy. And I didn't have the time to, teach Clint how to take a bus. After a period of time, we realized that Clint had become our best employee. Early to work, wouldn't take a break, didn't want to go home at the end of the shift. The job had become everything to him. Customers were coming to the store and saying, the reason I come here is because of Clint. Clint makes my day. I walk in here, I'm angry, I'm mad, I've got a full day of work ahead of me, and I see Clint with a smile on his face, bussing tables, and it changes my day. And so we were hearing all kinds of feedback like that. The business grew very fast. We had five restaurants in 5 years. And each time we opened a new restaurant, we added people with intellectual disabilities in a position very similar to Clint. And after a couple of years, I noticed that there was a very different attitude towards the job by those who were disabled than those who weren't. They didn't look at the clock to see when their shift ended, or when the next smoke break was there. Their productivity rate was higher than those without disabilities. They never cut corners. They only did the job the right way. There's only one way. Once you teach somebody to do the job, they only do the job that way. Mm-hmm. They wore the uniform with pride. They were the best dressed people in my business. I noticed that there was a business case. I thought if we were to hire many more people who were disabled, we would have lower turnover, we would have lower absenteeism, and at that time I didn't realize that we would also have higher levels of people doing things in a different way, people who were going to be more innovative in the workplace. Now that came a little bit later, but around 1995, my wife and I decided to open the doors to anyone who had a disability on the condition that they could do the job or they could be trained to do the job. We were very clear that we were in business to make money. We were not in business to create a charity. This is something I tell every business when they start hiring people with disabilities. You're not there to be charitable. You're there to give them an opportunity, yes, but the only reason you're in business is to make money. And so we did not add hours. We did not create charity positions. Every single position that a person with disability was doing had to be done by someone at some point. So if we didn't hire them to do it, somebody else would have to hire to do that position. If they called in sick, which was very rare, somebody had to be called in to do that position. So it wasn't charity and it wasn't fluff. It was meaningful, and more importantly, every position was competitively paid. So if I hired somebody with Down syndrome and I hired somebody without the same job, they received the exact same pay. The result after hiring many people with disabilities is that our turnover went way down. Now, if you can imagine, minimum wage jobs for the most part in Tim Hortons, McDonald's, A&W, they're all minimum wage jobs to start. The turnover rate in that sector would be around 100%. In some cases, around 125%. That's normal. It's transient. People work for you for 6 months and they get a job offer down the street for $1 more an hour. They're going to take it. Of course they're going to take it. But people with disabilities don't. Because the grass for them is not always green on the other side of the fence. If they're working for a company that's treating them right, treating them with respect, paying them properly, and they know they've got it for sure thing, it's not necessarily fair, but it is the reality. And so they don't move. They stay. The turnover rate becomes much, much lower. The last 11 years that we were in business, our turnover rates were under 40%. And if you consider 40% versus 100%, and it costs anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 to replace one frontline worker in a quick service restaurant, then obviously we make more money. We had a healthier bottom line. But it doesn't stop there. The absenteeism rate of our 45 employees with disabilities, when I left the business, we had 45 employees with a disability, 200 without. Our absenteeism rate for the 45 was 85% lower than the 200 who didn't have a disability. And absenteeism had the cost as well. But the big thing for us, it was many years before we realized this, was the innovation factor. When you have an employee who's in a wheelchair because they have cerebral palsy, gets up in the morning, takes a shower, gets dressed, makes breakfast, gets in the elevator, goes down into the parking garage, gets in the car, drives to work, maybe with hand controls. They have done everything that morning completely different to you and me. And that transfers into the workplace. They become different problem-solving skills. They become more innovative. And it's so interesting to watch people with disabilities make changes for the positive in your workplace that you haven't even thought about yet. Making suggestions on how to do things, because in their day-to-day life, that's what they do. They do things differently. And Microsoft and IBM often say that innovation is not created by hiring brilliant people. It's created by hiring regular people who think differently. And it happens to be very true.
I have a couple of thoughts that I wanted to bounce back to you. And the first one was around people with intellectual disabilities. And we've spoken in another episode on this podcast about the sort of groove that those people can get into when they've got a routine that really works well for them. And so if I understand correctly, what you're saying is if the person is trained well by an organization that provides job training to make the whole day successful, and they get into this positive routine, they're going to stick with it and stick to it more so than maybe a different person without an intellectual disability who would be tempted once they're comfortable to cut some corners. And that's what's making your employees so consistent and good at their job. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I actually feel really bad right now for some of my former employees who will have a very hard time not going to work today. They're at home because of the pandemic, and it's very, very difficult for them. Now, when we go back to, obviously there's going to be some jobs in a restaurant that a person with an intellectual disability can't do. We know that. There's plenty of jobs that they can do and can be trained to do. But what's interesting is that, I've hired well over 200 people with disabilities. And every time they come through the door for the interview, I do a sort of a litmus test, because that's what we do as human beings. We judge. And I do sort of a litmus test, and I look at them and I go, I think I know the capability and the ability of this individual. And I can tell you I was wrong over 200 times, because the capacity, especially for intellectual disabilities, capacity to be greater and do more is always greater than what you think it is. I hired a young lady 20 years ago with Down syndrome. He was working in a different store to Clint, and she also had autism. So she was Down syndrome with autism. She didn't speak, and she was doing a job very similar to Clint. So she was bussing tables, taking dirty dishes in the kitchen, put them in the dishwasher, operating the dishwasher, and then putting the dishes back in the storefront. And over a period of time, she started to gain more confidence. She started to speak. Now, she wasn't at home. She had other things speaking. She didn't speak outside the house.
Right.
She started speaking in the workplace. And one day she said, "I'd like a promotion." And I said, "Really?" I said, "What would you like to do?" She said, "I'd like to make cakes." And that was back in the days when we used to make cakes from scratch. And I said, "Well, there's an opportunity there," because I said, "Our cake decorator is too busy. We need somebody to help her. Would you like to do that?" She said, "Yes, I'd love to do that." So she did. And she is remarkable in her skill once we trained her out to do the cakes. And she did that for a couple of years. And so this is probably 7 or 8 years she was with at that point. And she came to me again and she said, "I think I'm ready for a promotion." I said, "Really? What do you want to do this time?" She said, "I want to serve customers." And that's a big step. Yeah. That's a really big step. And I didn't think she could do it. So we have what we call Tandem Teams, where you have a person who is a worker who's actually speaking to the customer and taking the order. And then we have a second person who's at the cash who's filling the order. And there's a computer screen in front of that person. And there's real-time information coming from the cash register into the computer. And so the second person doesn't even have to listen to the customer. And so we put her in that position. And it took weeks for her to gain the confidence that she really needed to do the job properly. But she finally started to look the customers in the face, and she started to say thank you, and come again. And it just blew me away, because I even with the experience I had working with people with significant intellectual disabilities, I didn't think she'd be able to do that. The parents didn't think she would be able to do something like that. Her counselor, a job coach, didn't think that she'd ever be able to do that. And so I've always reminded myself that the capacity of people with intellectual disabilities are always far greater than what we think it is. Once you take away mom and dad, brothers and sisters, teachers, job developers, all the advocacy groups who are always out there to sort of help and in some cases make excuses for them, not in a workplace, not a boss, Now they have to perform.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you see them become the best that they will ever be in their lifetime.
That is just a fantastic story. And I
Mm-hmm.
hope for a lot of my students that their employment life can work out something like that, because it would be such an excellent outcome for them. When you're considering a potential employee, is there a skill set that you find is really fundamental to be employable?
Not really. When we hire people with intellectual disabilities, it didn't happen very often because although we had many people with intellectual disabilities working with us, they didn't leave. And so since there was a limited number of positions that they could do, the larger number of people with disabilities who were coming through the door were people with other types of disabilities, vision, low vision, deaf, autism, people with physical disabilities, missing limbs, and those are the larger number of people that we hired. However, because we were advocates in this area, we did find work for people with intellectual disabilities in many different places. One of the programs I worked with, because I'm a Rotarian, we created a program called Rotary at Work, in which we encouraged Rotarians in business to hire people with disabilities, mostly intellectual disabilities. In 5 years, we found work for 1,000 people. So we've had a lot of experience in bringing people with intellectual disabilities into the workforce, not just in our own workforce, but into the workforce overall. The most important thing is that you hire someone who has the right fit. You're not hiring them simply because they're disabled. You have to make sure it's the right fit. So if you're asking someone to come and work for you in a restaurant that is 80 degrees at the best of times, where your temperature fluctuations in the kitchen are massive because you've got these big freezers that go down to minus 20, and there's loud noises, and the work can be heavy, then you have to think about who you're hiring. If you're hiring somebody with Down syndrome who is reasonably fit and strong, yeah, that's going to be a great fit. If you hire somebody who is not or has other underlying conditions, such as a young lady who worked with us with Down syndrome who also had spina bifida, not a good fit. And if you don't make sure you've got the right fit, the chances are you will fail. The other thing is the employee must want to work at the job that you offer them. Too often, I would have job developers come to us and say, "Are you the employer who hires people with disabilities?" And I say, "Okay, I know what you mean. Yes, that's. Good. I have this person with me, this young lady, who wants to work here, and she'll do a good job for you." And so I would say to the job developer, "How do you know she would do a good job for me? You have no idea what we do here." Mm-hmm. He said, "Well, she can do anything." I said, "Well, we don't have a position called anything. So what exactly you're asking for me to hire this young person for?" But I didn't want to be rude. And so I introduced myself to the young lady, and I said, "So you'd like to work at Tim Hortons?" And she says, "No."
Well, that's clear.
Yeah.
And so I turned to the job developer and I said, "Well, when you did the intake, did you sit down and ask what she would like to do?" And it turns out that she wanted to work with cars. And so we found her a job at Canadian Tire. And I believe she's still there today. It's simple. Mm-hmm. You would never ask somebody to come and work who's not disabled into a restaurant who has no interest in working in a restaurant. So why would we do that with someone who has a disability? Mm-hmm. Tim Hortons and Walmart, it's always the fallback because it's easy. It's the low-hanging fruit. We've got to get our job developers and job coaches to understand that the workplace is massive. And people with intellectual disability can work in a wide range of sectors and a wide range of jobs. It doesn't have to be a quick service restaurant or Walmart greeting or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So Mark, I can imagine a lot of employers listening to this podcast being like, "Oh, this is such a great idea. I'm going to, make it a mission for my business to hire more people with, a wide variety of abilities and disabilities." But, they might be a bit concerned on how to train these individuals. So are there any resources that you have found valuable when training your staff with intellectual disabilities?
In terms of training?
Mm-hmm.
The most valuable type of training for a person with an intellectual disability is on-the-job training.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of groups across the country that have training programs, and some of them are good, some of them are not. The maximum amount of time you would want to have something like that is 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And really what you're preparing is soft skills. You're not preparing them for, anything that has anything to do with the job that they're interested in. That happens on the job training.
Mm-hmm.
If I have someone who is being presented to me as a potential employee who's gone through a 35-week training program, I know I'm going to have to deprogram them before I can get them trained in my Tim Hortons. All of these training programs are well-meaning, but all they're doing is moving out the date in which this person can actually work.
Mm-hmm.
All you're doing is putting a refocus back on education. The young person gets out of high school at 21. There's nowhere else for them to go, so they create these training programs. So the training programs in terms of not job skills, but soft skills, they're important, but they've got to be short and sweet. They've got to be very regimented on the curriculum. There's a group in Sarnia, Community Living Sarnia. Sarnia is in Ontario, very close to Windsor, Ontario, who have had extremely high success with a 6-week training program. Almost everybody who goes through that training program finds work. In fact, about 10 years ago, Sarnia was the first jurisdiction. It's a city of about 70,000 people. It was the first jurisdiction in Canada where the local agencies like Community Living ran out of clients. Wow. So everyone who was disabled in Sarnia who wanted to work got a job that year.
Wow.
Never happened anywhere else other than Sarnia.
Mm-hmm.
And it all comes down to attitude. It comes down to leadership. The mayor of the town was behind it. And the 6-week training program was so well put together. And then the outreach to employers was spectacular too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a key piece.
We do interviews with someone who has an intellectual disability, and regardless of how challenged they are. The interview is important, even if you guarantee the family or guarantee the job developer that they've got the job. You have to do the interview. It gives the person a sense of belonging, that they've achieved something. They did well in the interview, they got the job.
Absolutely.
That helps with the confidence as well. But we don't do structured interviews. It's more of a conversation, talking about themselves. What do they like? What are their fears about coming into the job? And so it's more of a conversation about this. And one of the best stories I have, this is going back almost to the time when we started. There was a young man by the name of David. And David had multiple challenges, intellectual challenges, but he was a hard worker, bit of a tough guy. And his job developer says to him, "Now, you have an interview with Mark tomorrow. I want you to take a shower. I want you to comb your hair. And I want you to put on some good clothes. And I want you to make an impression when you see Mark." And so David went out and rented a tuxedo.
Love it.
Yes. And he got the job.
Yeah.
He got the job.
So
and
great.
he worked with us for many years.
Yeah. Just showing that effort, right? I mean, it speaks volumes just knowing how much effort that they put in. So makes an impression for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
You were mentioning earlier that at least of the people that you've hired approximately 200 people with various abilities and disabilities. And I'm wondering if you could share a story with us of maybe when you had a problem with a team member who had a disability or had to, maybe even go as far as terminating their employment.
Terminating someone?
Mm-hmm. Or just a problem in the workplace with somebody who has an intellectual disability, and how did you handle that?
So you're asking me about someone I hired with an intellectual disability that I had trouble with or didn't work out?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah. So, well, clearly we hired well over 200 people with disabilities, and when we left the business, we had 45. So some left, some were fired.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big fear of employers, is what do I do if it doesn't work out?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the answer is very simple. You do exactly the same with a worker who's disabled as you would with any other employee. So if your policy is, say, for example, 2 verbal warnings, a written warning, and then termination, If you do the same with someone who's intellectually challenged or any type of disability, they have no recourse on it. There is no human rights claims. There is no Ministry of Labor claims. You've done what you're supposed to do. And as long as you document it, you've done what you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Difference is, quite often, or more often, the reason it's not working out is because you've made a mistake in hiring them for that position. It wasn't quite right. And so instead of firing them, you can usually go back to an agency and say, we need help. We hired Richard. Richard's not working out. We've tried everything, it's not working out. Instead of firing him, I think maybe we could find him a job somewhere else where he'd be more suitable. Well, we would not do that when an employee is not disabled. We would simply say, it's not working out. Thank you very much. This relationship is over.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gives us benefit. And that's why it's so important for us to continue to stay in touch with job developers and agencies. It's not just a one-time thing where an agency finds you somebody new for a job and then they go away and never hear from them again. You have to keep that relationship going in continuously, because at some point you might need their help. I'm an expert on business. I'm an expert on coffee and Boston cream donuts. But I'm not an expert, even with all the experience we have, I'm not an expert on intellectual disabilities. So it's important for us to have that relationship. But we have had bad behavior by people who are disabled. Having a disability does not discount you from being a bad person or having bad behavior. I've actually fired people with intellectual disabilities for theft. Stealing money or stealing food. It happens. It's rare, but it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
But spending the time to understand the skill level of an employee, potential employee, and then making sure you've got the right fit is so important.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we did for the last 15 years we were in business, once we became known for hiring people with disabilities, job developers would show up almost weekly at one of our stores saying, listen, we've got somebody who we think would be perfect for the job that you're advertising. And that was another thing. If I wasn't advertising for a position, I didn't want to hear from job developers. So you have to do your homework.
Mm-hmm.
Mark has an ad for a baker's assistant. This is your job description. If you're a job developer, bring me the person who's most qualified for that job.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the way job developers work. They show up at a Tim Hortons or a McDonald's or an A&W or Walmart or whatever, and they say, there's somebody who's looking for a job. They do a great job for you. That's always the standard line. And so to make sure that the job developers understood what was really required, they said to me, I have someone who's perfect for that job, that baker's helpers or baker or whatever it is. I would say to them, how do you know? When was the last time you baked in a Tim Hortons? They say, well, I've never baked. I said, well, now you're going to.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd bring them in for a 3-hour shift, and they would bake. And they would see the temperature differences and the 50-pound bags of flour I had to carry, and how hard it is to cut donuts. And I guarantee after 3 hours, they're ready to quit. But what it does is it shows them exactly what is required to do the job. So they always used to say to me, Mark, the person I had in mind definitely can't do this job. But now I know somebody else who would be perfect for this job. And that's how you make sure that you've got the right fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such great advice. Marla and I have the opportunity to interact with and work with so many amazing young adults at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. And one thing I know so many of them share is that they want to move into their own, house or apartment, and they want to get a job. So what would you say to our young adults who are eager to get a job, but are unsure of how to even start the search?
So first of all, what is your passion?
Mm-hmm.
What do you hope to do? People who have intellectual disabilities like Down syndrome have dreams and goals in life, just like anybody else does. So if your goal and your dream in life is to work with cars or work in a hardware store, then don't apply for a job in a Tim Hortons. Right? Mm-hmm. You apply for a job in jobs that you like.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that you might not have to start off in a job that you're not particularly cheerful of, but that should be your goal. That's where you want to go. It's very important to align yourself with a job developer, an agency, a job coach who is able to open doors for you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to get involved yourself with the job coach. First, the job coach in terms of what you want, what your expectations are, where you want to go, how far from home you're willing to go to get to a job.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things. If you're lacking in confidence, which many of us are who have disabilities, have a family member involved to help you along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But once you do find a job, then you will be on your own. It might be the first time in your life that you're on your own, and it will be scary. There'll be some fear. Trust me, it will change your life for the better.
Yeah.
And if your goal in life is to have a home, living with some friends, or living by yourself, if possible, the best way, and in fact the only way to do that, is to get a job and to have a paycheck, contribute your taxes so that you're contributing to the country like everybody else, and then use your money to help you pay the rent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you bring up such a good point at the beginning when you were saying to talk to them about what their dream job is and what is it about that job that they want to do. Because I often hear, I read a story the other day about how an adult with Down syndrome really wanted to go to medical school, and parents and teachers were like, no, you're not going to be able to do that for whatever reason. But it turned out, after having a conversation with him, he really wanted to have a job where he got to wear like a white lab coat. So then they decided, okay, so maybe what you can do is you could be the person that brings the patients to the doctor's office, or be like a greeter in that sense, or kind of an assistant in a doctor's office. So I think it's so important to understand what components of their dream job, like what is it about that dream job that they really like and want to do, and kind of explore that area in depth so that we can understand how we can help them really get on that path.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's so true. We have to be careful that we don't sort of burst the bubble of what the young adult wants to do.
Absolutely.
We have to be mindful that they, just like anyone, will have dreams and goals that may not be achievable. I mean, I wanted to be a Formula One champion. That was a ridiculous goal, but I had that goal anyway. Yeah. But, they're going to have goals that they're not going to be able to achieve as well, and that's okay. We can't get into a position where we're saying, no, you can't do that, or that will never work out. That's what happened to me. And I can remember in grade 11 going to my high school guidance counselor, the one and only time I went to my guidance counselor, and he made a long list of all the jobs I'd never be able to do. He thought he was being helpful. And so how did I feel when I left that office? Felt like a failure. And that's what we do quite often with people with intellectual disabilities, moms and dads and brothers and sisters, lovingly tell the young person, hopefully you get a job, but I don't think you'll be able to do that or do this or do that.
Yeah.
I too had someone who wanted to get into the medical field. This was a person who had significant intellectual disabilities and autism, who really wanted to get into the medical world. And then we found out the reason why is because she wanted to wear a nurse's uniform.
Oh.
That was it.
Yeah.
She didn't really have any understanding of what the job entailed, but she just wanted to wear a nurse's uniform. So we got her a job in a vet's office, where she wore a nurse's uniform.
Yeah.
And she loved animals and did a great job. So having those conversations, you do come to some conclusions that you may not have thought about before.
I wanted to ask you what you would say to business owners who are thinking about starting to hire staff with disabilities, and they're wondering how it would affect their business. What would be a good first step for business owners?
Great question. And this is the number one barrier. We ready everybody for work through school, through programs, through training programs, and then you hit a solid steel door at the other end. The unemployment rate right now for people with disabilities prior to the pandemic is around 52 to 54%, according to StatsCan. We know that number is very conservative because you've got about 500,000 graduates with disabilities from the last 5 years, 270,000 of those having post-secondary degrees who've never worked a single day. And if you've never worked a single day in Canada and you haven't contributed to taxes or CPP, you can't be counted in unemployment numbers. So that means anecdotally, that 54% is probably closer to 70%. So it's a massive talent pool, massive. A small percentage of those are those with intellectual disabilities, somewhere between 7 and 10%. So it is, even though it is a smaller group, it's still a very large pool. Most employers to this day still buy into a series of myths and misperceptions. They think if they hire somebody with a disability, first of all, it's a charity position, something that they've made up. And the fault for that is often on the job coaches. If they're approaching employers and bringing in employees for jobs that don't exist. You know, for example, a job developer will come to my business and say, I have somebody who can clean the windows. And so you hire them and they clean the windows. Well, that wasn't a job that existed before. You would usually have one of your other staff members clean the windows. It's not a position. And so what you've done is you've increased your labor. And of course, in times of difficulty or a downturn in the business, the first person to go is the fluff. In what they call the fluff in the business. Be the person with an intellectual disability is let go. And so it defeats the purpose if we're not doing this properly. But we have to educate our employers to understand that the myths and misperceptions are exactly that. They are myths, they are misperceptions, and they are stereotypes. Hiring people with disabilities is good for your business. It's good for your bottom line. Your turnover rate will go down. Your innovation factor will increase. Your safety rating will go up. Your absenteeism rate will go down, and that's just the main one. There's employee morale, overall employee morale. What employers have to understand more than anything is that if you look at the percentage of people across this country who have a disability, it's somewhere between 20 and 24%. It's the entire population of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC combined. As a percentage of the population of the country. Employers will often look at that number and look at their customer base and say, that's a small number. I don't see people with disabilities coming in my retail shop. I don't see people with disabilities as my customers or my client base. So it seems to me to be a very small number. And so they will ignore people with disabilities. And that would be a huge mistake, because if you take that 20 to 24% of Canadians who are disabled, and you add in the immediate family member, mom, dad, brother, sister, son, daughter, it's almost 70% of the Canadian population. That's a number that nobody in business can afford to ignore. So my message to them is you need to, in order for your business to succeed in the next 10, 15, 20 years, you need to engage the disabled community in real jobs for real pay.
And you bring along with them their whole family. You know, it's a huge piece of
that's
Canada.
right.
Yeah.
So there's so many stories out there, but one of the stories that I really like was I was going out for dinner with former Minister of Finance, Federal Minister of Finance, Jim Flaherty, a man that has done a tremendous amount of work for people with disabilities. But there was 15 of us who were going out for dinner, and one of them was an Order of Canada recipient and a gold medal recipient in the Olympics, but was in a wheelchair. And when we got to the restaurant, there was a single step in the restaurant. And so we couldn't go in. We had to go elsewhere. So what that restaurant lost wasn't just the $100 plate, $50 plate, whatever the case may be with that restaurant, for the one person who is disabled. They lost all 15. How much money did that restaurant lose by not being accessible? How much did they lose by not thinking how big the disability community is? I can assure you that a restaurant that hasn't put in a small ramp at that point in time is not hiring people with disabilities either, because it's not front of mind. And those are the kind of stories that change employers. And on top of that, to be so embarrassed when they found out that it was the second most powerful politician in the country after the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's a powerful story. Could we talk a little bit about your role today as a full-time disability rights advocate? What does this role entail?
It means a lot of different things. Now, I don't work for any particular organization other than Rotary International. As I said, I am a Rotarian, but my wife, Valerie, is a Rotarian with distinction. She is a director of Rotary, which is why we travel the world. She's responsible for most of North America, Alaska, Bermuda, and territories of France. So she has a very big area that she's responsible for. That gives me a platform as the partner of a director to speak at a high level to state leaders, corporate leaders about the importance of inclusion, the importance of accessibility, the importance of knowing that there's a huge untapped labor force out there. Doesn't matter what country I'm in, I can talk about it. There's a lot of countries doing some good things, so I learn as well. But that's one area in which I use my advocacy and activism. I prefer to call myself an activist rather than an advocate, only because an activist is someone who's looking for societal change. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a far higher level of acceptance of people with disabilities as just being you and I. We're not even close to being there. But the more noise we make, hopefully we will make those changes as the years go on. I'm the chair of the board for the Canadian Hearing Society, which has just changed its name now to the Canadian Hearing Services. A wonderful organization. I've been there 6 years now. I've been chair for the last year, and that gives us a voice in the deaf community. It's one of the fastest growing disabilities. Most of that is age-related. Some of it is industrial damage over the years, but now that people are 60, 65 years old, leaving the workforce, and they find that they no longer can hear properly. So we provide a tremendous range of services, including mental health services, which has become very big for the deaf community. It is to lose your hearing at 60 can lead to depression. It's different when you lose your hearing when you're born, if you don't know any different. So it's actually easier for me than it would be for someone who's now losing their hearing for the first time. I'm also the chair of the board for the Ability Centre in Whitby, Ontario. This is a $50 million building, sports complex that was built in 2012. I've been chair of the board for quite a while now. But this is an incredible operation that has all kinds of sports, running tracks, basketball, weight machines, swimming pools, and it's fully inclusive. We have about 5,000 members, and 65% of the members are not disabled. And so it's been a very valuable community-based gym, if you want to call it that, in Whitby, in the Durham region, which is just east of Toronto. But the important thing about the Ability Centre is the programs that we run. We run some of the top programs for people with autism, life skills programs. And we're talking about people who are very challenged indeed. And it's so great to see them come through these programs and then find work or go into volunteer positions if they're not capable of working, which of course there are some people who will not work. We've got partners all over the world. And again, that gives me a voice to keep talking about inclusion, talking about that big untapped workforce. So that's just some of it. I do quite a bit of media. I do interviews on TV, radio, magazines. Some of the big U.S. publications have asked me to do interviews. So get the message out there as much as I can. So that's really what I'm doing in terms of being an activist. I do quite a bit of public speaking, mostly in North America, but I've done some speaking outside of North America. And it's interesting. I find that when I sit down and talk to a group of business owners, about 10% of them actually go back and do something. So if I've got a room of 100 business owners, a Chamber of Commerce lunch or something similar to that, I know that 10 of them are going to go back and actually do something. And that to me, that's really worthwhile. I don't mind traveling, so I go anywhere I can to spread the message and the message is that hiring people with disabilities is good for your business. And then I explain why.
And so for people who are listening to you and then going back and starting hiring a more diverse group of people, the best thing that they can do after that is take a seat at the table like you have and talk about it with their colleagues and other business owners so that the news can kind of spread out from there. I mean, that's fantastic.
Very much so. Yeah, that's what we call business champions. In fact, when a job developer, wants to break into, let's say, for example, Home Depot. They don't know anybody in the Home Depot, but they have somebody who's got Down syndrome who wants to work at the Home Depot. If they approach the Home Depot to cold call, the success rate is very low. Mm-hmm. So what you do instead is you develop business champions in the community. And so you look at who has hired from you in the past and done so successfully. So let's say it's Walmart. You go to the owner of the Walmart, you go to the manager of the Walmart and say, listen, I need some help. Would you mind contacting the manager of the Home Depot on my behalf? Mm. And what happens is they speak a different language than what the job developer would speak. When I was in business, I was actually quite scared of job developers because I didn't know what they were going to sell me, because they would come in and speak a completely different language to what I understand. Whereas the CEO of General Motors Canada could come in one of my restaurants, we'd have a great conversation because even though we're in a completely different part of the scale, we speak the same language. Mm-hmm. In the 25 years that I've been doing this, I've never had anyone ever say no. And so that phone call from Walmart to Home Depot sets the stage. It's like small businesses in town. If you've got a small grocery store and you've had some success with that grocery store, and now you're trying to break into a local bank, for example. I don't mean literally break into a bank. Don't do that. Yeah. But if you're trying to engage the bank, you don't know anybody there. But you go to the owner of the small grocery store, and he'll say something like, "Oh yeah, I play golf with them all the time. Yes, let me give them a call too." And so it's so important. A few years ago, I published a piece called "The Baker's Dozen," and it was 13 things that I expect from a job developer if you're going to do business with me. Number one is to develop your business champions.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I think we should put a link to that on this episode page because it sounds like an extremely helpful resource. And I think just the strategy that you've just talked about now is maybe that missing link for some people of how do I, my kid wants to work in a spa, but I don't know anybody who owns a spa, and how you get to that point is through those business champions.
That's right. And we use competitive advantage a lot. Having employees in my business, I obviously had a competitive advantage over my peers. Mm-hmm. If my turnover was lower, if my absenteeism was lower, I'm taking more money to the bank than Tim Horton franchisees who are not hiring people with disabilities. That was a given. That was obvious. And so we use that from a competitive advantage point of view. We also do this for corporations. So one of the people that I work with is Randy Lewis. Randy Lewis is retired now, but he was at one time the CEO of Walgreens. Mm-hmm. Walgreens is the largest distributor in the world. They're based in the United States, and they're a pharmacy. At every street corner in the United States, you'll see one or two Walgreens. Walgreens decided to hire about 40% of their employees, people with disabilities, back in 2008 when they built their first distribution center in North Carolina, a place called Anderson, North Carolina. And they did. So after 700 employees, 40 of them were disabled. In fact, some of them were very challenged. But it was so successful that in its first year, it outperformed the other 38 Walgreens distribution centers around the United States. And it has outperformed them every year since 2008 by about 20%. Because of this, Randy decided to have a program, or create a program called Rock Your World. And any corporation could come into the North Carolina warehouse or distribution center and see for themselves what Randy had done. He showed them the books. He showed them the savings. He showed them how much his bottom line had been positively impacted. He showed them the fact that these people who have intellectual disabilities weren't just working in the plant. They were going to the pub after with everybody else to have a beer. They were going down to the chicken wing place and having chicken wings. They were living a full life. And while this was going on, he had created a better business for himself in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So companies will come in, and one of the rules was the CEO had to come in. So if it was a Rock Your World Day, Company A would come in with 20 people, usually executives, but the CEO had to be there. One day, a company came in, one of the United States, one of the world's largest manufacturers, and was so enthusiastic with what they saw that they decided to we're going to do this. We're going to go back and we're going to be the number one employer of people with disabilities in the world. They were so excited about what they were seeing. But after a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks went by, Randy hadn't heard anything. So he gave him a call, and he said, well, we got back to our place in Atlanta, and we decided we would probably do this next year or the year after, because other problems popped up, So Randy said, okay, fine. He put the phone down, and he picked up the phone again, and he called that company's direct competitor, another multinational making the same product, and said, how would you like a competitive advantage? That company took it. And in one of their plants in Texas, they have hired over 700 people with intellectual disabilities working in production. In that location, believe it or not, is 20% higher productivity than the other locations around the country for that brand. So we do use competitive advantage a lot when talking about employing people with intellectual disabilities or any disability for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't argue with those numbers.
Yeah.
I mean,
facts are facts.
Yeah, it's pretty simple.
Yeah. Mark, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I feel that you have given so many of our young adults, their parents and caregivers a lot to think about and have really inspired them to pursue meaningful employment. And on top of that, I feel like you've really informed business owners that their businesses will only benefit from hiring individuals with intellectual disabilities. And I think it's such a great thing, because I hope business owners listen to this, learn from this, and become business champions as well, and really understand the value of adding people with intellectual disabilities to their workforce. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think our work has become a little harder now. We're going to have to redouble our efforts once this pandemic is over. The unemployment rate for Canadians is obviously going to be much, much higher than what it was before we went into the pandemic.
Yeah.
And employers will be perhaps a little more reluctant to hire from the disability community if the pool of non-disabled people is very high. So we're going to have to keep pushing and keep talking to employers about the value of inclusion, the value of hiring people with Down syndrome, that the outcomes are measurable, the outcomes are significant. We're going to have to keep doing that.
Yeah.
I feel we're going to have to redouble our effort once this pandemic is over.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And with you leading the charge. So that's great. So thank you so much for doing that and for inspiring the rest of us to kind of step up and do that as well. So thank you so much again.
Thank you.
The Lowdown, the Down Syndrome podcast, is a production of Down Syndrome Research Foundation. Learn more at dsof.org and join the conversation at DSOF Canada on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The Lowdown is hosted by Marla Fodan and Hannah Mahmood, and is produced by Glenn Hughes. The Lowdown theme music and George Dew was written and recorded by Rick Scott.